I see nobody here is in the spit zone, so that's good. But we're going to be talking about a little more heavy topic. We're going to be talking about the Vietnam War. Vietnam War displaced 11 million people. It led to 7.3 million civilian casualties, including those killed and wounded. And it's a war that really divided our country in a lot of ways. It was one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. And we haven't really healed from it. Our society and our psyche is still traumatized from the Vietnam War. And it's ingrained in the American psyche in a lot of ways. So we're going to talk about that, but first we need to get to the history. So the history of the Vietnam War goes way back. It goes back to really the Nguyen dynasty is how far it goes back to. And the Nguyen dynasty was always fighting with China. And during a time when it was weak, France came in trying to get infused with the spice trade, competing with other colonial powers like Spain, like the British, like the Portuguese, and it started colonizing French Indochina, which was a collection of 3 entities: Laos, Vietnam, which was split into 3 provinces, and then Cambodia. And really what it was extracting all these things, rare minerals, opium, but really the key element was rubber. And this was referred to as white gold, for the trees would ooze, the substance to create rubber. But the Vietnamese would call this white blood. So really how we can characterize Vietnam is characterized in this, I think, this one clip. This is Paul Doumer. He is going to be the first Governor General of French Indochina. And this is his wife and daughter. And you see what they're doing here? They are taking coins and they're throwing coins as if, to Vietnamese children, as if they're pigeons. And, this is like a very dehumanizing element. And you can see sort of why later on in the Vietnam War, why they will adopt and be inspired by communism and communist elements, because you can see the clear class divide here. These malnourished, very poor children, and then this bourgeoisie class right here. And Paul Doumer, he will say, when France arrived in Indochina, the Annamites, the Vietnamese, were ripe for servitude. So coming into World War II, France is weakened. Nazi Germany conquers France, and France surrenders. And this leaves French Indochina in sort of a weak state. And they're forced to negotiate with Japan. Japan at this time is, conquering, going through their imperial structures, most of Asia. And essentially their propagandistic notion is Asia for Asians. And France basically has to let them be on the northern border. They say, okay, that's fine. But later on, Japan is like, no, we want all of Vietnam. So they invade. They take Vietnam within a week. And what starts to happen here is a colonial struggle. But what we do see here, right here, is sort of the first, this is a anti-Japanese propaganda poster made by the French. And sort of what you see is kind of the first elements of dehumanization of people from Asia. You see that this person is supposed to be Japanese, but they don't really look Japanese. Their hands are very like goblin-like. Their face structure is not really that human. And you'll see even in American posters, Nazis are portrayed as human. They're portrayed as cold, brooding, mean-spirited humans. But the Japanese are not portrayed as such. They're portrayed as goblinoids. They're portrayed as inhuman. And sort of we see this same traits happen. So an anti-colonial struggle emerges, and this is really an indiscriminate struggle. They are attacking both the French and they are attacking the Japanese, and they are led by Ho Chi Minh. This is the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or the Viet Minh. And they are inspired by two things. They're inspired by Lenin's Bolshevism, so Marxist-Leninism, and they are inspired by the American Revolution. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services will begin funding the Viet Minh. They'll begin training the Viet Minh. This right here is Ho Chi Minh sitting with basically American agents. And this is sort of a trend if you look through politics and history. Osama bin Laden, he was a CIA asset. Saddam Hussein, he was a CIA asset, right? And we kind of have this history of training people, and then we end up fighting them later. But he's inspired by the American Revolution. And so when he takes Hanoi and declares Vietnamese independence from the French and from the Japanese, he will quote the Declaration of Independence. He will say, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So essentially what happens is the French will want to take back Vietnam, and the U.S. Aids them in this effort. The U.S. decides that the French are better allies against the new rising threat, which is the Soviet Union. So they will start funneling and transporting and supporting with weapons the French to recapture their former colonies. By 1953, they will pay for 80% of the French budget trying to recapture Vietnam, but they ultimately fail. The Viet Minh take most of Vietnam, and they will partition, the state will be partitioned. Essentially, there will be a south and a north. And what you need to understand is there was no South and North Vietnam at this time. You know, the Viet Minh had captured various sites all over the country. And so what happened here is a split of powers, a split of rule. And what you will find is that they will try and host elections. These elections will be subverted. So they'll try and host elections to unite the country north and south. And John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, his brother, the CIA director, will, and along with Diem, who is the leader or dictator of South Vietnam, they will subvert these democratic elections. They will post propaganda posters here, basically saying that the Viet Minh are persecuting Catholics. Now, both North and South Vietnam will begin persecuting, Catholics will flee south. South Vietnam will start persecuting Buddhists. Buddhists will flee north. And the war just begins starting to escalate. Eisenhower and Kennedy will escalate. They'll begin sending these military advisors to train the South Vietnamese, but they really start participating in the fighting more and more and more. South Vietnam will also introduce the Strategic Hamlet Program, which are concentration camps in the Deep South. And this zone here, they will take South Vietnamese and they'll start putting them in these concentration camps to sort of get them out of the way. You'll see this trend happen, trying to get people out of the way. Diem will persecute Buddhists, and that's how you get this famous image of the Buddhist monk self-immolating himself, which is a very extreme act of protest. People often say, oh, it's mental illness or not, or things like that. But no, it really is an extreme act of protest. So when we see people self-immolate themselves in this country, like Aaron Bunchel, I think was his name, this is really an extreme act of protest. So Diem will be assassinated with CIA approval in 1963. And about 20 days later, Kennedy will also be assassinated. Kennedy he did escalate the war. He actually violated the Geneva Convention with the amount of troops he sent. He was not allowed to send that many troops. But in 1963, it looks like he was going to pull out. He had assassinated Diem, which is somebody we put in power. There was power struggle going on. Looked like we were going to pull out, but then Kennedy is assassinated. And Lyndon B. Johnson, takes presidency. And he will start putting our Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin. And essentially what will happen is the USS Maddox, one of our Navy ships will think that they got attacked by the North Vietnamese. And it's a fabricated attack. They didn't really get attacked, but they thought they did. And so Johnson is going to bring the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to Congress, and it'll pass almost unanimously. Only 2 Congress people will vote against it. And then we basically go to war with Vietnam. That's when the war starts. And our first thing is Operation Rolling Thunder. We will basically drop 800 tons of bombs every day on North Vietnam. So we're continuing campaigns that we did in North Korea, during the Korean War. We basically killed 20% of the North Korean population during the Korean War. So we wonder why they hate us so much. That's why. We basically did a genocide there. What will begin to start to emerge from the Viet Minh is the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. This will begin to emerge within South Vietnam. They will be peaceful for a period of 2 years while they were waiting for those elections that never happened. But then, because of the persecution of Buddhists and the persecution of all these other people, they will have to take part in fighting and take up arms. And they are not really driven by communism as much as they are driven by anti-colonialism, as they are driven by nationalism. And they will fight like they've always fought, using guerrilla tactics. They will build tunnels all throughout South Vietnam, probably like 200 miles of tunnels in some parts, just hundreds and hundreds of miles. And as we start taking part in the fighting, we basically will acknowledge that the Viet Cong, the VC, will fight like ghosts, essentially. We don't know where they are. They'll lay booby traps everywhere. And yeah, so they're fighting a guerrilla war. And this is a Viet Cong soldier. She's more driven by revenge. Her father is killed by the South Vietnamese, and she takes up arms when she's 17 years old, essentially. And she was named Valiant Destroyer of American Infantry for killing so many American soldiers. And what's very interesting and kind of shows the dynamic that the Viet Cong had towards Americans is, I can't imagine how many GIs I killed, but I never felt guilty about the killing I did. If I went to America and killed people there, I would feel very sorry. Since the Americans came to my country, I don't feel guilty. So this kind of shows that the French, the Japanese, the Americans, they just all kind of meld into this identity of colonizer. This is not personal for her, it's impersonal. She's fighting for her liberation, essentially. So now we'll get into the U.S. military policy. I highlight this here. This is Henry Kissinger. He got an order from Nixon to bomb Cambodia. The Viet Cong were running through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, ammunition through Cambodia and Laos and all these other countries. So really this Vietnam War is this all-encompassing war with Cambodia and Laos, and we will eventually pave the way for the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, and they will do their own genocide in Cambodia, which kills 2 million people. But a phrase that you will see time and time again is when he's giving the order to bomb Cambodia, he says, anything that flies, anything that moves. And you will see this time and time again. You will see kill anything that moves is sort of the unofficial U.S. military policy of the time. So before we get into the aspects of dehumanization, the policies put in place in the culture, the Vietnam War was really a working class war in the sense that 1.9 million people drafted in the war, 80% of those were poor or working class. And essentially what the US will adopt is they will adopt this idea of techno-war. And this is sort of the beginnings of the military-industrial complex. What techno-war essentially says is that war is a business now. It is not a heroic event. It is a business, and they start the managerial, class within the military. They will start operating it as a business. They don't really, when you read how they talk about their soldiers, they don't really care about their soldiers. You are a working class individual, and the industry you are in, the production process that you are doing is you are trying to produce death for the state. That is what you are producing. And this is Ron Kovic. I protested with him when I was a little baby. My mom had me in a stroller and pushed me along. We protested the Iraq War. His story is incredible. He will be a very big anti-war advocate. And what's so surreal is Ron Kovic, he massacred a bunch of women and children during his time in the war. And what's so surreal is, like, after reading his book, what he experienced, to think that I marched along somebody who had done that and now is, devoted his life to ending war, ending conflict. It's just very crazy to think about. But in his book, there's one moment where he gets paralyzed and he's in the hospital bed. And one of the military commanders is going to each bed where these people are injured and just giving out Purple Hearts. Here's a Purple Heart for you. Here's a Purple Heart for you. Not really knowing what they did. And it kind of, diminishes the idea of a Purple Heart and things like that, but kind of demonstrates what the Vietnam War was like, what techno-war was like. But the Vietnam War will become very divisive in this country. It'll become, the country will become very divided, perhaps even as divided as we are now, or more divided, who knows. And the country will sort of be separated into war hawks and war doves, those who want to end the war, those who want to continue the war. But yeah. So before we get into war crimes and all this stuff, we have to talk about the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre happens, and when it happens, it's hailed as a victory by the U.S. military, a successful operation that occurred. But it was a massacre, essentially, and it was a pretty horrific massacre. It will not be leaked till a year after, and when it is leaked, it'll be a very big scandal within the United States, and the Pentagon will create the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group. They will start investigating war crimes all throughout Vietnam, and they will gather lots and lots of evidence. They will also delete evidence. Essentially, their job was to hide evidence from the public. They did not want another My Lai massacre to happen. And So while they're conducting their investigations, and they do this throughout the war, they actually find there's another massacre not too far from My Lai called My K. And what they start to see is a pattern throughout the war, that this is a systemic issue. And rather than address the problem, they try and cover it up. And these are some of the most, some horrific images from, a lot of the images taken at My Lai are the moment of people's death. So they will actually be destroyed. But if you look My Lai, you will see some very horrific photos. One other thing I want to mention is they will blame, and this is sort of where you see the working class element happen, the Pentagon and the US military will blame one petty officer by the name of William Calley. And William Calley did commit horrific acts during that day, but who gave the orders was Captain Ernest Medina. And he basically says, kill everything that breathes. And US soldiers ask, are we supposed to kill women and children? And he says, kill everything that moves. So how does this happen? How does this occur? Well, it really starts with US basic training. US basic training was a full-scale indoctrination program of young recruits. Young recruits were forced to eat garbage. They were forced to exercise to the point of collapse. They were primed to do what's necessary, and they will be told you can only use racial slurs. You cannot call Vietnamese people Vietnamese. You have to call them these racial slurs right here. Here's a quote from Wayne Smith. The drill instructors never ever called Vietnamese Vietnamese. They called them dinks, gooks, slopes, slants, rice eaters, everything that would take away humanity. That they were less than human was clearly the message. And another one says, I screamed, kill, kill. So when I got to Vietnam, I was ready to kill. And a very common phrase was, if it's dead in Vietnamese, it's Viet Cong, it's VC. And in 1969, they will do a survey, and 60% of Army officers said they would use torture or the threat of torture on prisoners during interrogations. They also found that 20% of captains and 25% of lieutenants believed it was legal to conduct summary executions on civilians caught setting booby traps or spying. So we see that it really starts at basic training. But there's 3 on-the-ground policies that will carry out such horrific war crimes and the systemic issue of civilian massacres. These are search and destroy policies is one of them. This is brought over from the imperialism onto the Philippines. We bring this over. The Philippines was a very horrific war, which was just massacre after massacre after massacre. The problems with search and destroy is the Viet Cong dictated engagement, right? So they basically, you didn't know where the enemy was till they were shooting at you. The other thing was US troops admittedly didn't understand what search and destroy meant. I'll quote Nick Turse here. He says, the systematic destruction of hamlets and sometimes everyone in them. This is what search and destroy meant to US military operatives. The next thing that will be introduced is free fire zones. This was under the assumption that every civilian was put into those concentration camps, strategic hamlets. Sometimes they will drop pamphlets over areas, and these areas will be called, set up as free fire zones. Means you can kill anybody there, and this will be reinforced by the Mir Guk rule, the MGR, essentially, which is this very dehumanizing attitude and unofficial military policy by which Vietnamese people aren't real people, they're just gooks. So the Mir Guk rule, the MGR. And in these free fire zones, 300,000 civilians will be wounded or killed. And then the last policy, and perhaps the most surprising, is this is brought over from the Korean War. This is the body count policy. This created killing quotas by which when you went out, you had to get a certain amount of kills or you would be punished. You would have longer time in the field. And sometimes to get high body count, people will just murder detainees. And here's one officer saying, "Damn it, I don't care about prisoners. I want body count." And he says that just before they execute a prisoner. You will get awards for high body counts. You'll get R&R, rest and relaxation, badges or medals, beer and food, base camp assignments. And it creates this culture by which people start competing with each other for kills. And this can be, these are largely, civilians that are being killed in this because you need a body count. You need a body count measure. And civilian kill boards will be set up all over South Vietnam. They'll be put on people's helmets, on tanks. And here's just one. Bob Gabriel, Army veteran, says, I got in-country R&R for killing the most gooks in a month. Everybody sort of kept track. I had like 15 confirmed. And before I end off here, I just want to say there is a whole, this is just the on-the-ground policy, but there is a whole other military policy which is in the air, and it's bombardment, and it's napalms, and because they could not, the U.S. military could not find the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese revolutionaries, they put together this policy to just wipe out the jungles of Vietnam. They'll do napalm, Agent Orange, things like that. And so I just want to say that there is this whole other aspect. 4 million people today still feel the effects of Agent Orange. So I will just end with this. This is a poem from a marching song composed by the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division. We shoot the sick, the young, the lame. We do our best to kill and maim. Because the kills count all the same, napalm sticks to kids. Ox cart rolling down the road, peasants with a heavy load. They're all VC when the bombs explode. Napalm sticks to kids. Thank you. Yeah, so there's several reasons. I grew up around a lot of South Vietnamese people. I went to international school. And I grew up around a lot of Vietnamese veterans as well. I heard their stories and things like that. And it was always very fascinating to me. The other element of it is I'm Iraqi, and a lot of the policies that happened in the Vietnam War, they will just be taken into the Iraq War. They'll be taken into Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, all these places. And, we sort of look back on Vietnam and we go, we say we made a lot of mistakes in Vietnam. But when you do this research, you see that mistakes would imply that our intent was not to do those things, essentially. And I'm a history major, and we're taught, and I really do sincerely believe this, that the study of history is the greatest exercise you can perform in empathy, essentially. And sometimes that means studying some of the most, evilest things that occur in the world to discover the true essence of our own morality. So that's a little bit of the, heart and soul that went into my research. And this is just a short blip of all what the Vietnam War will happen. It'll spill into Cambodia and Laos and all these other places. So this is just a small snippet of it. Yeah. There was no separate ethnic group. So North and South Vietnam, these are colonial creations. They don't exist. The only differences were religious ones. There was Catholics and Buddhists, and then communists, which probably weren't religious at all. But it will formulate, a little bit into that will be a little bit of the divide, but that's not really what it's about. If you go to Vietnam today, they won the Vietnam War. This is the first war that the United States will lose, like definitively lose. And it's interesting, if you go there, people don't really have like animosity towards Americans, right? And it kind of just demonstrates like this was an anti-colonial struggle. It was a struggle for independence. It was not, you know, a divide between this ethnic group and that ethnic group, or this religious group and that religious group. It was these outside powers imposing their own worldview onto them and wanting to gain resources and maybe even test weaponry, which we didn't talk about the air war, but that would be another aspect of it, yeah. No. This was not, the philosophy was more so techno-war, which is, again, the beginnings of, you know, war is a money-making machine. So there wasn't really a manifest destiny element to it. I think the people in power, they sort of view themselves as, right, I guess we as Americans too, that we're the greatest nation in history, right? And if you have that belief, you kind of have to, you know, relinquish the idea that other societies could be, you know, equal to you. So I think in a lot of ways, they didn't really see Vietnam as, you know, an actual entity, right? There's only the United States and things like that. So, yeah. In the Vietnam War? Yeah. So the My Lai massacre was one of those things. The U.S., that was something the U.S. did not want to happen, right? When it did happen, they created a secret task force to try and cover up things like that happen. And it isn't till, you know, there's 30,000 books on the Vietnam War. And we didn't really learn about the Vietnam like war crimes working group till the early 2000s. And investigative journalist Nick Terse, he will stumble across these documents and he will write a whole book about it and basically see like that was the missing link to the war, like that this was a systemic issue. These war crimes were, this dehumanization was a systemic issue. So yeah, the media during the Vietnam War was, or the US military at least, was trying to cover things up. I will say, it was one of the most unpopular wars. The Iraq War will be another very unpopular war. So the media will reveal things. And I think because we didn't have that manifest destiny element, the media was more likely to reveal those things. Whereas the Iraq War, I mean, people still believe things that just aren't true from that war. But some things will come out like Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, things like that. But yeah. Yay.
So I am not the Chancellor.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever met him, but I am not he. Mm-hmm. But on behalf of the Chancellor and the district and also of Norco College, we'd like to present this award to you, the Chancellor's Award for Academic Excellence.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, look at it. Actually take one step this way.
Okay.
There we go. Closer together. Cool. 1, 2, 3.